everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If I said it would rain someday in the future, this would be true, but ultimately unhelpful. If I said it would rain tomorrow, this is much more helpful, but it also opens me up to the possibility of being wrong. If I said the rain was tears cried by extraterrestrials, this would be false. This illustration is probably seeming pretty obvious and also pretty strange by this point, but it demonstrates something that we all consider intuitively without actually thinking about it deeply: the verisimilitude of the statements. So, you and I were talking a couple weeks ago about, wanting to do an episode on truth.
Yes.
And we kind of were looking through some of the podcast history and episodes we've done in the past and stuff. And I said, well, what about verisimilitude? That seems like pretty interesting, and it's along the same lines. Mm-hmm. And so we're going for it today. So it's a $10 word. What is verisimilitude?
It's a $10 word that I think some folks who have been attentive students in high school, perhaps, or college would recognize. And others, I think gamers probably recognize whether all kinds of Venn diagrams I just set up. But it is the attempt to do a consistent approximation of the real. It may not be the best definition, but I think it's a start. Because I'm trying to include both the ancient mimetic or mimesis, which is another way of thinking about verisimilitude, trying to create things in art according to life, which Plato and Aristotle talked about. So I'm trying to do that, but also accommodate the where your opening went so well, which is the logic. So that's where the consistency is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting definition, because I guess I really hadn't thought about it in that way. But yeah, it really is this idea. It's fascinating because in doing the research for it, it comes back to what philosophy is all about, which is how do we know something, right? It's knowledge, right? It's that
epistemological imperative.
Yes,
do we know this?
Yeah. So can you give us a quick overview of the philosophy of Karl Popper? Because he's kind of the name that's associated with verisimilitude.
I smile every time his name comes up because all I can think of is Mr. Popper's Penguins, which is interestingly taking a snippet from his life and waxing on not very necessarily verisimilitudinously.
Yeah.
Which is a word. So Popper was trying to... He went through a couple of phases with this, but he was essentially trying to establish, because when he was writing and thinking, this was still a thing, absolutism in truth or non-truth, and was suggesting, and this is going to sound topsy-turvy, but was suggesting that the more content one has in building a theory, the less probable where the theory is going will be. And the less content and the more improbable, the more truthful it might be. I remember wrestling with it the first time I encountered it long ago, and I still wrestle with it. And I think it's one of it didn't last.
Right.
It didn't survive the test of time, so to speak, but it was fascinating. And he was really the first person to try to theorize about the idea of verisimilitude. Yeah.
And, he had some intellectual integrity, like you said, later on, the theory was sort of questioned and picked apart, and he said, oh yeah, well, why didn't I notice that in the first place, right? He wasn't so so proud of what he had done that he was just going to stick by it no matter what, right?
No, not at all. And I think the thing with Popper is, I'm trying to find one of the quotations I wanted to, but I'm fiddling around here. I think the thing about Popper is that he was encountering and trying to give articulation to the places that the discussion can take us. For instance, if you look at science or anything related that is theorizing about the world based on epistemological data, and you realize that over the course of history on a mega scale, a macro scale, every theory is essentially not entirely right. And thus the scaffolding that we've talked about before, where we think we're progressively going further toward the truth. But on the face of it, if Popper was looking at this as, well, this failed, and the next one failed, and the next one failed, and the next one failed, so the history of philosophy and philosophy of science is a failure. And then said, well, no, but that's not true. Because there is, in fact, a going closer to the truth, like what you said at the very beginning.
Yeah, it's interesting. The example that always makes it pretty clear for me that I like to use was the idea of epicycles in medieval cosmology and astronomy, where all the way back, for thousands of years, since the beginning of humanity, right? People have been looking at the stars. And then at some point they figure out, hey, some of these stars are moving in a pattern, right? And they start trying to figure it out, and they develop telescopes. They go, oh, those are planets. Oh, okay, well, these planets must be orbiting something. So let's figure out what their orbital period is. And it turns out that this is a amazingly complex thing, because obviously we know now planets revolve around the sun, but rather than just the gravity of the sun interacting with the planet, the gravity of all the other planets and the planet's moons, all of these things are playing into that, are tugging it in different ways as they go around. So not having the data, or even the mathematics to describe what these planets are doing, what they're finding is, oh man, it's really hard to predict how these things are moving in a circle. So, well, you know what? If we say that these things are sort of spinning in a smaller circle as they're orbiting, that gets us a lot closer. And they're like, well, that's still not right. So we'll add a couple more little circles. Well, it's still not right. We'll add a couple more. And eventually you have all of these planets spinning in all of these different circles as they orbit around. Well, if you look at it scientifically, right, or in terms of truth, they got a lot closer to describing how the planets go around in a circle by adding these epicycles, but it wasn't it was false, right? So that to me kind of encapsulates this concept of verisimilitude, where it's like, all right, so if we can observe something, or we know, we have some sort of knowledge of how something's happening, and then we try to describe it, and we come up with a theory that's close, and then it's proved wrong, and then we come up with another theory, and it's closer, but it's also proved wrong. The fact is, we're really not doing anything different even today in modern science, right? Me getting a doctorate, as I'm doing my studies, you find out that, there's very strict guidelines covering how you can write a research paper. And one of those guidelines is that you can never use the word proof, right? You can never say this, this proves that this thing is a cause, or this, how you want to say. You can only disprove things. And that's built right into the mathematics of statistics and analyzation in science. So if things can only be disproved, and if we're constantly disproving these things, is there an absolute truth? Or can one of these things that's false and another of these things be false? Can one be more true than the other if it's false by definition?
It can be, because it's predicated on the ancient notion that a number of current politicians seem to be quite willing to discard with prejudice is that we seek the truth. I am unabashedly unembarrassed by the idea that that's what education was once about. And for some of us, it's still what education is about. But yes, you can have a statement that by itself is false and yet leads to truth. If I say Perry is close to Paris, that's patently false. If I say Perry is closer to Paris than to a place in Vietnam, perhaps that isn't as false. And so there's a degree of specificity that can cause that truth. The term, and I know you've encountered it, is truthlike.
Yeah.
One word, truthlike. That's the other word for verisimilitude. And so if you make an authentically hearted attempt at finding the truth, you're invariably going to say false things, but then immediately want to revise them, recognizing their falseness, but looking ahead to, well, but how does that take us toward planetary movement or whatever it is that we're talking about?
Yeah. So the word truth likeness, what that word in itself reminds me of the prefix pseudo, right? Which always leads you into interesting spots. I remember one time I found a pseudo scorpion here. Really strange looking creature. Okay, well, here's a scorpion, but it doesn't have a tail, right? And then I really started digging into the taxonomy of the creature, right? Anything with pseudo in front of it, it raises these questions about where did this thing come from, and how do you categorize it, and how does it fall into things?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think truth likeness, if you call it pseudo truth, that adds a whole different shade of meaning to that word, and it leads you into some very dangerous territory, right? Perhaps, obviously an example that everybody in the world is familiar with at this point is COVID, right? And so, as the pandemic went on for 2 years, you saw science constantly revising its positions on guidelines. And you really saw two camps of people as this was taking place. There was some people that recognized that, basically the scientists were working with a novel disease, and that as they were gaining more information, they were having to revise their theories. They were finding out, the virus doesn't act in this way, so we need to change how far apart people are, or what masking conditions they have, or what sort of things are going on. And there's been a constant revision. And that is just a microcosm of the history of science. That's the way it's always been. No matter what the subject of inquiry is, the science has never remained static. It's always developing, and things are being falsified, and new theories are being put forth. And like I just said, you can never claim that a new theory is true, or that there's proof that it is conclusive.
No.
But you can operate within the theoretical construct until you come up with new information that falsifies that theory.
Right. The falsification approach is, I would say, is Popper's largest contribution.
Right. So you have your one camp of people that are thinking that way. And really you see that within Popper's own life, as we were talking about, right? He put forward a theory, and other philosophers stepped forward and said, well, this really doesn't make sense. And he said, you know what? You're right. I wish I had seen that, which is a perfect example of him living out his own thoughts.
His autobiography is worth a read. It's called, just the title tells you exactly what we're, Unended Quest. An intellectual autobiography.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And reviewing my notes for today and thinking about that, I'm thinking, well, and we were talking about the hero's journey, which is another word for a quest. Well, quests go on the quest for the Holy Grail went on, and so I seem like I'm diverging, but I think I'm going to bring it back to or you can have a series of smaller quests that attempt to fulfill the larger one, but never quite get there. One of my favorite poems by Yeats was called Ulysses, which is also the Odyssey, Odysseus, right? And Odysseus goes through 20 years of seeking, falling down, making mistakes, insulting the gods, getting punished for it, all to get back home. He gets back home. He essentially devastates all the people who have been trying to marry his wife. He gets reunited with his adult son, who's been out there looking for him. And what does he turn around and do? Goes back out. And these lines by Tennyson: I am part of all that I have met, yet all experience is an arch, wherethrough gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades. No matter how much you've accomplished, you cannot catch up with the untraveled world that continues to move on. And you can try to go through the gate, but even if you get partway through the gate, you're not going to get all the way through.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what Popper was living. And I think that's why some of his approach was honorable with the falsification idea.
Yeah. Yeah. The hero's journey. I mean, that really does play into it, right? The quest for science is very similar. And speaking of verisimilitude in the more modern sense, like you talked about at the beginning, video game evolution has really been a good example of this, right? Back in the day, in the beginning of video games, is essentially emulating physical games, right? Like, oh, you're playing ping pong, or you're playing golf, or you're doing something like this. Yeah. You know, as computer capabilities and graphics capabilities increased, you started to develop these linear stories in video games that really sort of replicated the hero's journey in other media like television and books, where, all right, you start out and you at the beginning, and then you follow this linear quest, and the game keeps you on this path and whatnot. And then, 15 years ago or so, as again, computer capabilities are increasing more, graphics capabilities are becoming more realistic, these sorts of things. Games started to become what they call open world, right? Which is where the game no longer keeps you on this path. There's no invisible walls saying that you can't run into this forest or whatever. You can go anywhere, right? And increasingly, you can do anything. You can live on a farm, and you can plant vegetables and harvest them and do all these mundane things, right? And they add in side quests, right? So instead of having a main quest and having these levels that you complete in order to finish the main story, in addition to that, they have these little quests that you go off and do that have no impact on the main arc of the character. And there was one game that got so good at doing this, series of games, the Elder Scrolls, right? Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, right? Where there's a large group of people with these games that have never done the main storyline. They've started the game, and then there are so many things that just sort of grab your attention off the bat, and you start going down these rabbit holes. And sometimes these side quests are even made up of multiple parts, that have their own story. So you forget
the original quest.
Right. And so you just end up in this endless cycle of doing these different things. And that really is art imitating life, right? Because we talked with the hero's journey about how in real life, there's very rarely this circular thing. It's not a closed loop, right? One journey leads into another. There's other journeys that are starting at different points of it, and that's the way life works. And increasingly, entertainment in the forms of video games or virtual reality and these sorts of things are starting to emulate that in a way.
They are. Now, this is interesting. You were talking about the games. And I'm thinking Aristotle was establishing a set of rules, essentially, which of course have been broken, that mimesis requires a strict adherence to the real. So a play is not supposed to accommodate any more than the time period that the play actually takes. 2 hours from the day of a character or whatever it happens to be. That's so limiting that, there have been many fine works created with that, but artists started to push back. I think verisimilitude is in the idea of, well, you write fantasy. I love fantasy and science fiction. But in any literature, verisimilitude means that, in part, that you are not violating the implied rules of the world that you have created. So there shouldn't be moments when a reader who might be accepting that there are 20 moons orbiting the world, and perhaps the orbital dynamics are presented if it's science fiction, but then one of the moons falls on the world and it still survives. And you say, nope. And so here's a really ridiculously kitschy example, but I kind of found it funny. There was this whole series of Transformer movies. So we already know what level I'm talking about, right? But I said, okay, fine. We got to one, and I don't remember the name. I'd gone with my son to enjoy it, and and Leonard Nimoy is voicing this older character who's an alien, a metallic transformer that has a metallic beard. And I'm saying, this is really taking me out of the world. And then the transformer world somehow gets placed in the close to the Earth, touching its atmosphere. And I'm sitting there laughing and saying, where's the wind? Where are the earthquakes? Where are they?
Right.
And so that was not verisimilitudinous.
Right.
Now, it was up to a point. You say, okay, I'm going to accept that these metallic creatures can be hurt. I'm going to accept that sometimes they can transform into machines and back into what they are. I'm sitting here. I paid the ticket. I'll accept that. But even within that, we know that we're in a world that we've accepted. We know it's not real. But the writer or the director or the scriptwriter, whatever genre you're talking about, just throws something in and you say no. So we've hit that wall of the verisimilitudinous.
Right. Yeah. There's an inability to suspend disbelief. So I guess, has the question of verisimilitude, I think we can say it's always existed. Yeah. But how do you think it's evolved as bodies of evidence have evolved as well? So as science and as art have developed, are there certain ways that our conception of verisimilitude has changed over time, or do you think we're still asking the same question?
I think we're asking some of the same questions, but not expecting necessarily the same result. I think that the largest shift was very recent, and that is within the past 60 or 70 years, when pretty much everyone, it wasn't just the quantum physicists, it was how that all spun into every other discipline, realized, and you've been alluding to this and referring to this, that there isn't an absolute, unchangeable, static, ultimate truth. That doesn't mean there's not truth, but to try to reach that is counter to everything we have come to know. So it's sort of a meta thing where a verisimilitude is transferred verisimilitude.
Yeah. It is interesting how, like you said, since the middle of the 20th century there's just been a lot of developments that essentially broke our worldview, right? The Newtonian mechanics had been around for so long, mm-hmm. and our inability to, access the early early observations of the universe, our inability to access the information on how our own brains work. All of these things led us to develop a pretty stable worldview. And like you said, that was something that had always existed throughout time, but there had been these big changes. Newton obviously shook a lot of things up, but then things settled back down. There was a reality was shattered, but another reality was created.
Yes.
What happened after, not even so much after Einstein, but with quantum mechanics, and then with the adoption of fMRI to look at the human brain and probe these questions of consciousness, and the development of powerful space telescopes to look back, into
in time, essentially,
into time. What happened is the reality, the Newtonian reality that we had settled into was shattered. But there wasn't another reality that was readily available to stand in as a new foundation or settlement on which everybody could grasp onto. Instead, everything was sort of thrown into this uncertainty of, what if there isn't just one reality? What if there isn't just one truth? What if, these things, and that really continues to this day. And as science marches on, and even now, we're starting to grasp, how some quantum computing works, and the James Webb Space Telescope will let us see to the beginning of time and all these things. I don't think that a new stable view of reality is going to necessarily appear out of this advance in science. If anything, I think it's going to get a little bit more messy.
I think so too. A lot of things are getting more messy, and so I think that is, for me as a layperson, really is the biggest tangible change. Arguing about the whether verisimilitude leads us into nihilism or leads us into undue optimism, that was the debate across a couple hundred years previously. But no, the fact that which is really desperately important to grasp onto when you look at that and say, well, okay, so there are many truths. Well, there are many things that feel like truths, or that evidentiary material will lead us to, but that doesn't allow us, or shouldn't allow us, to forego our responsibility to look at the connection between data and what the data seem to say. It doesn't mean, we just give up, everything's real, it's all relative. Which is where I think a lot of people are just going, it doesn't matter. No, there's still stuff. Here's an example. I read it this morning, and it's a topic you and I deeply committed to in different ways, which is education. There is a new education training in Florida for history teachers that they're calling it a boot camp, and for changing the curriculum. And the curriculum requires teachers to say, among other things, that the United States Constitution never established a strong line between church and state. Now, that's patently false, and one can look in the Constitution and see it. And so when that kind of statement gets made and people are supposed to ideologically accept it, we're running straight away from any possibility of truth. And so that falseness can be identified, clarified, removed. Let's look at the text. Let's get closer to reality again. So I think we have a really, more now than ever, responsibility to factuality, at the same time as saying, no, it's not going to lead us to an ultimate truth, but there's still truth in facts. In the knowledge.
Yeah, you sort of answered my next question before I even asked it, which was, what gives a theory a greater degree of verisimilitude?
Isn't it fun that we know each other well enough?
So that was my next one, was what gives a theory a greater degree of verisimilitude? And So we'll go a little bit deeper. Let's go back to, say, my COVID example, right? I mentioned the first group of people, which are sort of with the scientists who say, listen, we're going to put forward this theory with the understanding that things are going to change, right? Our knowledge of the virus is going to change. The virus itself is going to change. Things are going to happen that are going to relegate our current knowledge as obsolete or even false based off of the unknown unknowns, right? And some people are willing to accept that uncertainty as long as it's within the framework of science and continue forward. There's a second group of people, right, who say the scientists don't know what they're talking about. Technically, in some regard, they're not wrong, right? Because, like we just said, the scientists, there are unknown unknowns. And then there are things that are going to change in multiple areas that are going to render things false or obsolete. But then if you disregard what, science, then the route that goes, how you acquire knowledge is going to lead you in a very different direction.
Yes.
So I guess if with that question, what gives a theory a greater degree of verisimilitude? Is it really just getting close to the truth? Does it matter how you get there? Let's say
it's getting closer to the truth. It doesn't matter how you get there. Well, yes. If you stumble on it, okay. I mean, it's not that our friend Mandler, this is the way. Well, okay. Well, there are a lot of ways to get toward the truth. But if you're committed to that particular way, then you're going to practice the principles of that. But that implies principles. That implies a structure. It implies a logic and a rationality. So to get anywhere, in art even, yes, you have inspiration. You have those epiphanic moments of boom and a light bulb, whatever we want to call it. But there's still a rational approach to how you use your materials to create something. In history, you examine the evidence. You don't throw the evidence out unless you find that, the Constitution is a fake. It really wasn't written this way. We don't have the original Constitution. I full well expect somebody to start saying that. Right. I full well expect that to happen.
Yeah.
It dropped through the wormhole, and this is an alternate universe's United States Constitution, and blah, blah, blah. But so it doesn't necessarily matter the way, it's the how.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an interesting thing when I started my doctoral studies looking at quantitative research methods. They listed several ways that people come to know things. And the first one's superstition, which is essentially just is almost luck, right? Or guessing, right? So you have pretty much, you can be wrong as often as you can be right, but there's no real rationality behind it. Then there's intuition where, again, you aren't using any sort of scientific principles. But there might be some sort of internal rationalization that puts you in a right direction, but you still there's a very good chance you're going to be wrong. Mm-hmm. Then there's observation, right? You can watch how things unfold, and you can use rationality to sort of infer other things. And that's sort of the first step in a scientific approach. Then you have, an actual interview process, right? You're actually interacting with things and then using data to determine how they work. Then after that, there's an experimental approach where you're actually isolating things and determining how they interact to inform some sort of causal relationship. So that was interesting to me because the way the textbook presented it, right, was that, you can have a superstition and be right. And you can probably see that happening throughout history. Maybe somebody, if you take, if you do this sort of thing when you get sick, then you'll be better. And then you find out down the road, actually, there were things that went into it, but they were just lucky.
Yeah.
Or it could be intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Well, my gut says that if I do this, I'm going to be right because I have some experience in the past with this, and it takes you down the right road. You could still be wrong, right? And you can observe and do these things. So verisimilitude, right? The truth likeness. Again, it's that idea of, what is getting you closest to
Right. What's the process?
right,
What
right.
it's the how.
And so with our COVID example, right? So if you have the people that you have the camp that is with scientists, and then you have the other camp that says, well, if you do this crazy thing, it gets rid of COVID, or, COVID's actually a hoax or whatever.
Right.
And they're gaining knowledge through some of these lower level things, superstition or intuition, or maybe even a very rudimentary observation that doesn't have any regimented data collection, right? Well, it's pretty obvious if you look at the statistics and the numbers and the hospitalizations and the deaths, who has a greater degree of verisimilitude in their theory, right? But it's taken a couple of years for that to build up the body of data and the body of evidence to present this.
Right.
And that, it's just a microcosm, right, of science in action, right? And that's the difficult part of living in history, right? Instead of looking back on history, living in a context, right, is that in the moment, science is working on several suppositions that are going to change, right? But if you trust the process that's laid out in how we gather knowledge, right, how we get closer to truth, as the body of evidence builds up and the data builds up, we usually see it borne out as being verisimilitudinous.
Well said. Well said. If this is leading us away from where you wanted to go, then you just tell me. But I'm thinking very much from the art view again, right at the moment. There has been a marvelous festival, New York State Puppet Festival going on in Perry, where we are at the moment. And here are people from fifth generation and his son, sixth generation puppeteers who performed last night, an American puppeteer who's extremely well known in his coterie of people, his team. The last time they did the show that is in the Perry High School was in Paris, just before the pandemic. And now it's in this little town of 3,500 people, more cows than people kind of place.
Yeah.
All right. And these puppeteers, not all like the Muppets. The Muppets are pretty amazing, but it's not this. There's Bunraku puppetry, there's shadow puppetry, and the elaborate nature of telling a story, or how it can be elaborated. You see in the traditional puppetry, the kind we were looking at last night, three people sometimes manipulating one puppet, and they're in blacks or in veils or in various things to de-emphasize them. But sometimes you see their faces, and the puppeteer's face is focused on the puppet, and the puppeteer's face sometimes reflects all the moods that are going on in the puppet. And that's to take us as the audience to reflect us right off that puppeteer and into that being. And sometimes you're so caught up with the puppet that you accept that this story is happening to these are beings. At the same time that you see the shadows of the people moving them. It's an amazing process. It's a transformative process, and it very much holds to what we've been talking about today. It's truth likeness, moment to moment to moment.
Yeah, and if you see a really good ventriloquist, it does the same thing, right? Because if they do a good enough job disguising their mouth movements, and they have a varied enough vocal pattern, you really start to believe that this ventriloquist dummy is a separate entity, right? It's very, very strange, right?
Kids, and not just kids, adults. I guarantee you have had this experience. Well, I would like to. I can't quite. It's truth likeness, but You go somewhere and somebody pulls out a puppet and starts talking to you, your attention goes to the puppet.
Hmm.
Even if the person's just vocal, but, hi, my name is, and you're watching the puppet. You
Right.
say, yeah, tell me more about yourself. There is something, whether it's spiritual, magical, psychological, all of it braided together going on, that we will accept that and know at the same time that it is an imitation of life.
Yeah, and what's always fascinating to me is how little humans need to get to that point. Like think about reading critically, right? Mm-hmm. Here's an animal that picks up an inanimate object and stares at it for minutes or hours at a time. No movement, nothing happening. But inside your head, there's this rich experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you isolate that, right? If we just say, all right, that there is, you take yourself completely out of the human perspective and you just look at it from the outside, you go, this is insane. What you're doing is not directly contributing to your survival or your homeostasis or anything. You're just sitting there completely still, right? And so that's one of those, like I was talking about just recently, there's been several areas where as science has progressed, the idea of verisimilitude is undergoing a sort of change away from this ultimate truth to the identification that truth can be found in several different ways within a same discipline. And this applies to the fMRI and the study of consciousness and the study of, this inner experience.
Yeah.
And thinking how this developed and what its utility is, right?
Well, there's utility again.
So how should we or should we delineate between truth and accuracy when talking about verisimilitude?
That's an interesting question. Well, if you're taking, again, the idea of it being an evocation of an iteration of some elements of reality, then accuracy, as in the consistency of a character in the arts, would be required. So if a character behaves in a certain way and then just suddenly starts to do something completely differently, and there's no causal analysis, there's no evidentiary why, then you sort of say, nope, the writer was being inconsistent. Even though human beings can be inconsistent all the time, there's a consistency in that. we have character. So accuracy, and in the logical sense, accuracy would be the motive, the modal element to attempt to get to the verisimilitude. I may say false things, but if I'm trying to establish, I'm whacking away at the wood, so to speak. I've got to find a path. All right, so I say that in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's wonderful extended discussion about this in terms of planets. Well, we say there are 8 planets. Yeah, but when I was a kid, there were 9 planets. And somebody gets all upset about that, right? Well, yeah, but then the definition of planet altered to make it more accurate. And that more accurate alteration leads us to the 8 planets. But if I were to say, well, there might be 200 planets out beyond we're in the Oort cloud, and someone else says there are no planets out in the Oort cloud, the might be 200 planets is closer to possible accuracy than the absolute declaration there are none.
Yeah. This question, it is an interesting one. Sometimes I surprise myself. But yeah, this idea of accuracy versus truth.
Mhm.
And I think it it's hard to think about it scientifically, but I think it's easy to think about it artistically, right? When I think about music, over the past 20 years or so, there's been a large development in tools that help you fix mistakes.
Mhm.
So an auto tune, so that your voice is always hitting the right pitch, or a quantizer, so that your drum beats are always on time. These sorts of things, right? And so when you apply them to an audio production, not that there's anything wrong with using them, but if you overuse them, right, you end up with this very sterile sounding recording.
Mhm.
And for all intents and purposes, that recording is very accurate, but it's not very truthful, right?
Yes. It's meticulously accurate, attempting to be perfect, which renders it less truthlike.
And you see this or in video games, right? Sure, graphics are increasing, right? You come up with something that is much more accurate in terms of being immersive from a sensory viewpoint. But if the storytelling or the mechanics or the other things that bring you into it because it appeals to the truth of what it means to be human are absent, then all of that accuracy doesn't really make a good video game, right?
What is it called? The uncanny valley?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, with AI.
But if the uncanny valley is what takes your attention, then you're missing what the attempt is in the first place.
Yeah, it's Star Wars robots, right? So you have this R2-D2, right? He doesn't have any characteristics that are that scream sentience, right? Yet viewers have always had this connection, an emotional connection, or some sort of intellectual belief that they can interpret the beeps and boops and the actions and stuff. Well, you might have, whereas you have a C-3PO that is very humanoid and speaks, a human language and stuff. But the connection might not be there. The accuracy of a robotic representation of humanity versus the truthfulness of a robotic representation of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. You see R2-D2 and you have this emotional connection and you see the things that he does, and it makes you realize that is what I as a human would do in this situation. Then you see C-3PO bumbling around and, trying to talk people out of doing the right thing, and you go, well, this is not what a human would do, but he looks and speaks like a human would, right? So I think with art, it is sort of easy to draw that line, not necessarily draw the line, but look on that spectrum and say, okay, well, something can be accurate, but not necessarily truthful, or vice versa.
Well, with science and history, it requires more care.
Yeah.
It requires art requires an investment too, in the sense of, I'm going to consider this. I'm going to let it, I'm going to experience this. Or you can just look at it and say, nah, that's not my kind of art because it doesn't look real, and walk away. But if you are serious, you will, and vulnerable, you will have an experience with that art. It might not be a great experience. It might be a life-changing experience. But with more knowledge-based or intellectually polished or focused, perhaps, things like science and history, then it requires that investment of thinking, not just reacting.
Yeah, and I think the reason that gets real messy, right, is because with art, the humanity is put into it in the beginning stages, and then the product of it is not human, right? It's human inspired, but it is not human. So it's easy then to look at a non-human thing and try to determine accuracy or truth to humanity. With science and with history, these are human things. These are things that humans participated in. These are things that humans actively are part of. And so as a result, again, we'll bring in that word pseudo, right? It's easy if I create a scorpion out of wood, right? It's easy to say, well, that's not a true scorpion. But if you see an actual pseudo scorpion, it's harder to say, well, is that a scorpion or is it a different kind of arachnid or what is this thing, right? I think that there's something about the immersion factor that causes us to have, like you said, it requires more critical thinking, right?
It does, because also you can back away just a touch from it and say, well, in calling this a pseudoscorpion, what am I allowing myself to miss? Is it scorpion-like only in visual, or is it? And I don't know what a pseudoscorpion is, so I got to go home and look this up now too. But just on the surface of it, by giving it a name, you are inviting, and we do this. We invite missing what else might be there.
Yeah, there's the categorization that causes issues because much like science, right? Any categorization is likely either false or not taking into account information that's not available or isn't aware of the unknown unknowns. So categories shift. And that makes people very upset. They don't want categories to shift.
People don't want change. People want change seemingly and ask for, but when you look at the aggregate of humanity, historically there's a lot of change that many people do want, but the push of culture is always no, keep it. And so we have to fight against this constantly.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it from like a personal standpoint, right? You have truth and the antithesis of that falsehood, right? If you think about getting caught telling a lie, right? It's pretty easy to determine if somebody's lying to you, right? Because all you have to do is just ask a few questions about the person's narrative, right? And if somebody's telling the truth, they'll have the answers, and the answers will all make sense. If they're telling a lie, they might have to think about constructing the story because it didn't actually happen, or the parts of the story that they just come out with might not all add up. You can extrapolate this on a macro scale to conspiracy theories, right?
Yes.
You can look at them and say, yes, okay, well, you might have an outcome here. The outcome might be something that makes people much more comfortable. But do the steps of the narrative require a very specific, delicate way of developing in order for this to be true? Or do the steps of the narrative not make cohesive sense when put together? And that's the sum of it, right? The process of science is to start out with evidence and draw a conclusion that you know is going to change as things progress. Whereas anything else starts with the conclusion and tries to pick up the steps or the things that point to it in retrospect.
And then be precious and twee and coy, like something like QAnon. Oh, I've been silent for 2 years. Now Q will speak again. No, thank you. Go back to your dormancy. We don't need it. Because, if you got something to say, say it. No, I'm going to offer it in riddles because you really don't have anything to say. But it's a carnival barker thing.
Right.
And that's what a lot of conspiracy theory is. Now, I loved the X-Files. The funny thing is I loved it because it was just good storytelling sometimes. But, there was never this is the way it really is. No. I had no idea in the 90s enjoying the X-Files. But I'd be later on in my life in a time where everyone believes. They don't just want to believe. They do.
Right. And there's a presentation thing, right? I mean, if you're encountering this on TV, again, that's an art form. So it's easy to delineate that from reality and say, okay, well, this is a story that's being told. The internet is a much murkier medium.
Oh, yeah.
Where, sure, it's part art. There's definitely people creating art on the internet, but there's also genuine human interactions that are happening. And some people blur the lines between the two and are able to lead people astray legitimately, because it's not a television show that's being presented to them that they can easily decipher as being real or false. It's a person on the internet, they believe that they're interacting with somebody who is telling a story, right? And rather than entering into the critical thinking process of investigating this person's credentials or whether the story makes sense or whatever, you're getting sucked in by that medium. You just come to expect, okay, well, I read things on the internet all the time and I assume that they're true. Well, that's a very dangerous thing to do.
It is. And it also plays to what we know about confirmation bias, which can lead us way away from verisimilitude as well. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So is there such a thing as ultimate truth, or is truth on a spectrum of accuracy? I think that we've pretty much talked about this.
Yeah, I think truth, for me, at this stage, the truth is on a spectrum of accuracy, and if you're talking about a great, big, large truth. But I think there are plentiful, demonstrable truths easily gotten to through rationality and factuality every single breathing moment. It doesn't necessarily lead us to this ultimate truth. But we don't spend all of our days, every single moment, thinking about an ultimate truth either. I think one trains oneself in the daily interactions, even interacting with text, whatever it is, the daily thought. You take a walk, and you notice what's going on around you in your walk. And if you're honest with yourself, and you say, well, I don't know. I think I've mentioned this before, but sometimes my granddaughter would hear a noise and say, what's that? Now, the first inclination is to be the answer giver, right? Well, that was, no, I didn't know quite what it was. And so I had to say, well, that might have been, and I had 3 different things in mind. Well, do you know which it is? I really don't. I think that's so important to say to anybody, but especially to a child.
Right.
There are things we don't know this moment, and we might be able to figure it out. We can't answer everything.
Right. That's the important part, right? There's things you can't figure out, and some of them you will be able to figure out, but some of them are always going to be mysteries, and that's philosophy.
It is.
Philosophy is, it's difficult because it's epicycles, right? It doesn't matter how much we learn. We use the things that we learn. We use the data. We use the processes, all the new insights. But with the understanding that we're never going to know. We're only going to get closer to knowing. And that's kind of the fascinating part.
That's enough for me.
Yeah. No, it's that uncertainty. I think for some people it inspires them and it drives them on, and for some people it's unsettling, And I think that kind of determines how you approach the way you gather knowledge.
Sure, and that's not knowing some things you would rather like to know can be medically can be troubling, unsettling, drawing your thought down all kinds of rabbit holes. And so you seek facts, and sometimes you don't get them because the doctors don't necessarily know either. I'm just grasping at different fields to just say this is verisimilitude is a thing about reality TV. It's not.
Right.
And why? Because it's the same. It goes back to the scientific principle. When something is observed, it changes the dynamic of that thing.
Yeah. There's even if they weren't staged, right? There's no way that these people that are being observed by cameras that know they're going to be on TV are going to act the way that they would if they weren't observed.
Walk into a woods and notice the difference in the sound.
Right.
And you can think, well, I'm just out having a nice walk in the woods. Yes, but you are affecting the life around you just by taking a step and another step and another step. And so you can't know. Did my step into the woods drive a deer to run down through the woodlot and thus out across the road, and a car hit it, giving a very bad day to the person who owned the car because I stepped in the woods? I don't think we have to linger over that and feel responsible for everything that happens in the world. But I think it should give us a kind of humility to say, well, I may be having effects that I didn't necessarily intend.
Right. We all have effects that we don't intend, and we all have effects that we don't know that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, that can be unsettling to some people, but that's part of life. It's part of the universe that we live in.
Yes.
All right. That was a fun one. Until next time, keep going.